for us to have a friend of mine from Harvard Center for Middle Eastern Studies, Dr. Evangeline McGlynn. We are working together on a project which is related to Ottoman history, European history, and cartography. She received his degrees not in the field of history or Ottoman studies in general. She worked as a geographer and cartographer for many decades in different institutions, particularly on disaster studies. She's quite famous when it comes to making analysis using the different systems, including GIS and STS. Dr. McGlynn holds a PhD in geography from the University of California, Berkeley, with a secondary concentration in science and technology studies. And she also has another degree in School of Design from Harvard University. The subject of her dissertation work was the legacy of the 1988 Spitak earthquake in Armenia. And in relation to this work, she is now working on Kahramanmaraş earthquake that happened recently in Turkey. She is a GIS specialist and a professional cartographer for more than a decade. And I am really happy to have her here today with us, and I'm really eager to learn more about her recent comparative work of Ottoman translation of Atlas Maior, with, of course, with the original Atlas Maior. It is a 17th century atlas that we may consider as the peak of cartography in early modern period. So the floor is yours, Eve, and please enlighten us with your insights from cartographic perspective.
Thank you so much. First, I would like to thank Dr. Çalışır for inviting me here and for starting this project and bringing me on. It's really been exciting to work with this new material. I'd also like to take a moment to thank Professor Jamal Kafadar, my PI at Harvard University, without whom we also would not have made this connection.
Sure.
So without any more ado, I'd like to present some very preliminary work. So I'll start with all of my caveats. I'm not an Ottomanist by training. I'm a cartographer and a geographer by training. I'm interested in these maps on their own terms. Nevertheless, I'm quite excited to share these preliminary observations with you, which we hope will be part of a much larger project talking about the Atlas Maior and its role in the Ottoman world in general. I would be delighted if someone raises their hand in the Q&A and said, "I can't believe you haven't read la la la," but we shall see. So just to give you an idea of the talk structure, we're first going to talk a little bit about what the atlas is and where it's coming from, and then I want to spend the majority of the talk making some structural observations on how these maps work as maps. And finally, a little bit of information on the contact zones that are depicted in a couple of the maps, as well as some directions for future research. So to begin, the Atlas Maior was the most expensive book produced in the 17th century. The Blaue Atlas, as we'll be referring to it for the rest of the talk, was made by the Blaue Press. This is a second generation printer. It's a large family of print makers. It was done through letterpress, so movable type, and engraved map plates. They produced hundreds of each copy. The Latin would have been the largest press run. The only thing that kept the Spanish run from full completion was a fire at the press shortly before Johann Blau's death. On the other end, El-Damashqi receives this atlas in the 1670s. It was given. The original atlas was given as a diplomatic gift to Mehmed IV. And in 1675, Damashqi was commissioned to do a translation. It took many years. This is what we're going to be looking at. Just to give you an idea of how maps work in this document, because consider there's also a large amount of text in this corpus, which Professor Çalışır can expand upon a lot more than I would. The Latin copy at the National Library of Scotland has 594 maps. The court copy at Topkapi, from which we're operating, is about 248. Knowing that there's one volume missing, we can scale this down to equivalence, and it's about 231 in the Ottoman translation, and about 310 in the original. But you'll notice that it goes, this map count falls precipitously once we start talking about different manuscript versions. The Norosmaniye had 0 when we last checked. There are other copies that we just haven't seen yet. So the relationship to the visual image, as opposed to a larger exegesis on geography, within these translations, is something that's somewhat plastic and deserves a bit more study as well. But we're going to be looking at the biggest corpus that we have, which is about 248 maps. I promise I'm not going to go through each one individually. But I do want to spend a moment at saying the court copy is a very faithful reproduction. So whenever there is a map in the court copy of the Atlas Maior, there's an equivalent in the Blaue Atlas. So we're not looking at this in terms of Ottoman cartography on its own. This isn't a remapping, this is a reproduction of existing maps. And that's important to think about, because we're not looking in terms of technical cartographic skill. Instead, we're thinking in terms of what visual vernacular is more legible to an Ottoman audience as opposed to a Dutch or general Western European audience. This is just my favorite spread of a couple of them to give you an idea of how close they are. We shouldn't be looking at color here. We should be looking at composition. So it's that they're choosing the exact same angle of everything. This is a clear reproduction. Also, just a note on color in the Blaue Atlas. Just like the Ottoman version, Blaue Atlases were generally made to order. There's a different sequence in which they are produced than there's an ascribal tradition. Color is always last. The color in printed atlases, so color is going to be a little bit wild over here, and then a little bit more staid in the Ottoman version. I have no real comments about that other than these are more the same than they look. So let's move right into some of the structural observations. I want to start with typography. Some of this is just the reality of the languages being used. So Latin, Dutch, French, and Spanish all have one alphabet in common, the Latin alphabet, as opposed to the Perso-Arabic being used in the Ottoman version. These then have different possible visual variables for differentiating one scale of label from another. So just in a corpus of text, you might have a title, a heading, a subheading, and body text. That differentiation is even more important in maps because you don't have ordered space, but you still have hierarchically organized elements within your map space. So while in Latin you have size, same with Ottoman, kerning, which is the space between letters, whereas the Ottoman would have what I would call Kashida justification, which is those long, elongated letters. The Ottoman, it's because they are doing it by hand, they also have color as opposed to the printed atlas. Letterpress printing, known then and now as the Schwarzkunst, the black art, is an obsession with finding the most black ink and then coloring later. We're not dealing with color in terms of labels. That would make the most expensive book in the 17th century even more expensive. But they do have case, so as an uppercase, lowercase, sentence case, and different kinds of style, bold and italic. So there are more elements that can be used in Latin text to create these hierarchies, which means that different strategies are necessary on the Ottoman side to create similar things. Just to give you a quick example, here is the same area roughly on the two versions of or on the two atlases, and we can see here in red Polonia, Memleket Le. Also, I realize they wrote Poland underneath, but this is it's an exception and maybe a bad example. But we see this elongated word to describe Poland in the purple Kuavia, but we're using color, and then the body text, the lowest labels, down here in pink. So we see a bunch of different kinds of ways that the text is being used to differentiate between areas, between parts of countries, between individual cities. I should also point out the density differences between some of these. You'll notice that rivers are labeled on the Latin version, and they do label many rivers in the Ottoman Atlas, but you see fewer of them, including here, and they tend not to be written along the river in the same way. So there are just some differences in the way that text is being used that creates opportunities and also limitations for how we can read these. Also, just a brief moment on paleography. I'm taking one word, bahar, sea, which you would expect to be at about the same level in the hierarchy on almost every map. But A, it's not. We can see different colors, different justifications. And B, it's clear that there are many hands at work. This is a team effort. It appears to be written layer by layer with different figures involved with different kinds of labels. On the one hand, that makes the hierarchy of labels very, very clear. One doesn't bump into the other. On the other hand, you have beautiful calligraphy at the very top for the cartouche, and then whatever poor 15-year-old apprentice is writing the final labels has a different experience with calligraphy that becomes increasingly clear when you're trying to make out individual town names. Also, whoever was doing Dutch, just do better. I find that penmanship fun. But going back to the orientation, I have a little label problem there, I'm sorry guys. You see different standards that are based on the kind of alphabet. So for the islands, you see the Latin text is privileging staying in one direction. So even on one side of Corsica, the labels are anchored by the end. On the other side, they are anchored by the beginning of the label. Whereas on the Ottoman side, we're always anchored by the head of the text. And when I say always, I mean most of the time. Both atlases are breaking their own rules occasionally as well for fit. Similarly with rivers, this is where the standards are nearly the same. Both the Ottoman and Latin texts are anchoring the head of the word to the river. I wanted to point out in red a little detail where there's a little more tendency to be able to label a city on the opposite bank of a river, and a little less tolerance to do so in the Ottoman version. Again, these are tendencies, not hard rules, but trying to feel these out gives you a better sense of what the process of creating these maps was like. Also, Latin text really likes to be horizontal. The Ottoman text really likes to be in line with the rest of its texts, with the rest of its neighbors. So we have some, again, not rules, habits that emerge the closer you look at all of these maps. One thing specific to this atlas that I don't have an example of at all on the Latin side is a complete change in orientation. So this is way too far away for any of you to read, but all of the purple labels are facing up, all of the red labels are facing down. So this has implications both for the process of making the map and for reading it. As a map reader, and consider these are about yay big, about 50 by 30 centimeters, the open folio. Is reading a map an exercise of walking around a grand table? Is it an exercise of turning the book? Are people more comfortable reading upside down than I am? Or is this privileging the habits of the scribe? Are there multiple people working from different angles? Or is this someone circling a table for the areas they can best read? I don't have a great answer for any of these, but I enjoy finding these pieces because it has, again, some indicator of a very different process for creating the map than would have been in a Dutch workshop. Before we go to the next piece, I need to give you a really quick geography lesson. When I say the word graticule, I'm referring to the invisible grid that we use to understand maps. I could also say latitude and longitude. Latitude is fat. Those are the equator up into the North Pole or down to the South Pole. Longitude, long, is how we measure how far east and west we are. In the modern day, it's how far east or west from Greenwich, England. Longitude as a concept is still a soft one in the 17th century. It's not until the mid-18th century that the technology is precise enough to be able to make longitudinal measurements at sea, which gives you an idea of what's happening in the Age of Discovery. Whereas latitude is a physical observation of which there can be a general agreement, longitude is a political decision. The longitude labels for all of the atlases in question are, if you'll forgive the phrase, all over the map. But the fact that they're there is because this is an evolving concept. Graticule. When we're talking about maps here, we're really talking about the graticule ticks, which is these little areas on the border which will number what the latitude or longitude is in a given place. When we're looking at them in both of the atlases, the unit is degrees and then minutes. Later, you'll have degrees, minutes, seconds. 17th century, we're not there yet. In terms of numerical representation, Latin is our standard Hindu-Arabic numbers. In the Ottoman court copy, and you'll forgive the sequencing, my computer does not like the Persian 4. You have Persian numerals, and then Persian numerals for degrees, abjad numerals for minutes. Abjad numerals, for those who are unfamiliar, it's like the equivalent of Roman numerals when we're speaking English. They're letters that represent numbers. In this case, Ya, Kaf, Lam, Mim, Nun would be 10, 20, 30, 40, 50. You won't see more than that because we're working in, again, minutes to degrees. Latitude more present than longitude, I already said, and these affordances that are created are based on the medium, not only in terms of alphabet, but also the tradition versus printing traditions. So to look at them here, here's our 44 degrees 10 minutes, 44 degrees 20 minutes, and the same here. We have Persian numerals, and then we move into Abjad. The reason that I'm bringing this up is because it's actually a creative way to separate these two units much more easily than happens in the Latin text. While you're engraving, it is easier to be very consistent on subtle size changes, sure, but by changing the kinds of numerals, you never have to compare to you never have to compare to other numbers to make sure that you're at one level or the other. And granted, 31 and 10 is not very ambiguous. 31 and 50 might be, depending on where you are in the world in that moment. The other thing that comes up is that whereas the Latin version will have graticule ticks all the way around, or occasionally just on two sides if they're only using latitude or longitude. The Ottoman maps are working for efficiency. Rather than writing the same numbers again and copying the same information, they take the more efficient route, and every time there's a round robin on the Latin, there's just north and west or south and east on the Ottoman version. We should also say that orientation here, there are no north arrows, but each side is labeled north, south, east, west. And I find this so charming. There are a couple of clear instances where the Ottoman map is done a perfect reproduction of the Latin map, but they still label the top as north. So north as up is, again, an evolving standard, and we can talk about this in the Q&A where that comes from. There's a point where, as a reproduction, it doesn't matter what the Ottoman view of where north should be is. Rather, they're so used to north being up on every single Latin map that's copied that every once in a while, when for compositional reasons the cardinal directions are rotated, it will still be labeled as north. And the part that makes me so happy is something could be labeled as north, and then someone else noticed and goes, oh, no, no, no, no, no, and corrects the mistake. So we have maybe a half a dozen examples in that corpus of 248 maps of mislabeled orientations, and these two glorious examples in Germany of someone coming back in and saying, hey, incorrect. Which again speaks to the many hands of the, cartographic atelier at the time. And while we're still on various kinds of measurements, a couple notes on scale. So here is one of the provinces of China. You'll notice there is a scale, but it's unlabeled. An unlabeled scale is just a pretty decoration. We can't do anything with it. There aren't many examples of that, but the fact that someone had to draw the scale carefully, and then there's another person coming in afterwards, presumably to label it to render that rectangle meaningful. But not everyone was on the job, apparently. And we have all sorts of different variations of this. We have the empty scale. We have the labeled scale. So you'll see, and this is the same in the Latin version. Just like longitude hasn't been established, there is not an agreement on what a mile is. And because the Blaue Atlas is based on many, many, many different sources, each map has to have its own internal scale. So you'll have the Italian mile and the German mile. So sometimes one or the other, sometimes both at the same time. So there's some ability for comparison if you're more familiar with one unit than the other. And they are copying the same here in the Ottoman atlas. You see the Russian mile and the German mile up on top. We also have unlabeled scales. So it's good to know that there are two different versions of measurement that we could use in this map, but we don't know which one they are. So that also makes it harder, if not impossible, to use. And then we also have additions on top of what the original maps were. So this Mil Islami was added in later. Another interesting thing about numbers that excites me a bit is that we have multiple numbering systems at play, again, as a stylistic choice to separate entities that need to be read apart from each other. So, for example, on the top, the Russian mile is written in abjad numerals, while the German mile is written in your standard Perso-Arabic numerals. Siakat is also being used on another map. And the one that is interesting here, the person who added the Islamic mile is operating in a different direction than the people who wrote the German and Moscow miles this way. So we're looking not only at different types of numbering, but also different reading directions. In terms of legends, so the symbols that the place where we figure out what the symbols on the map are, there aren't many in either in Atlas. Most were in the Chinese volume. You can see all the text from the Latin version here. I haven't included it on the Ottoman version because it's not there. The beginnings of the legend are there, but there's not a single one that's labeled. And again, going between print and scribal production, the difference between having a stamp that you could reproduce very easily and redrawing each time the same symbols, there are the margin for difference changes. So the uniformity is not going to be the same when you're hand drawing it every single time. But you do get to add gold leaf, so back and forth. And I mentioned these. No one here is a bad cartography. The space for the legend is being added. Just someone hasn't labeled it. So these missteps or weak links in the team give us an indication of how the maps were produced and in what sequence, which is exciting because it helps us see the anatomy of the map a bit and get a little more insight into the process that we wouldn't have otherwise gotten if everyone was doing their job perfectly. There's very little decor on the Ottoman maps. I'm using the two major exceptions, both in the New World volume. The Latin map is covered in various, we're going to say, ethnographic depictions of the people and animals and heraldry of the various areas. Some more problematic than others, but this is also an indicator of many of these plates were being reused from previous atlases. A map plate, if you're doing dry point etching into metal, takes a really long time to produce. The more you can recycle it, the better. So some of it is a question of that, and some of it is Blau's specific style, which is quite ornate. The Ottoman version of Dimashqi, on the other hand, is quite bare, concentrating on the individual areas. Whoever was doing the New World volume got very excited. I added a seam so it would be very clear which one was which, but honestly, I could put those two I could put those two drawings together and you wouldn't notice other than a color difference. They're that close. And I'm not sure why or how, but something is going on there. I would also point out in the Guatemala plate, while there's a cultural distaste for the cherubim that the Dutch and surroundings seem to have enjoyed, this herbaceous I don't know, decoration is indicative of mimicking the style in a still lush but maybe more appropriate to the audience way. So we have a few examples of those, but they are generally fairly sparse. So with all of these pieces of the map taken care of, I want to talk a little bit about contact zones. We're missing one volume. I assume it is the one that includes Ottoman lands. It is insane to me that we do not have maps of the Middle East in the Damashki Atlas. None. So this is so what we're going to go through right now is my efforts in finding anything close to the edges of what would have been Ottoman lands at the time. I have 4 maps of the 200-something. And this is just a little bit of an indicator of what kind of methodology we're thinking about using going forward. So this is the very edge of Hungary. It's actually a map of Styria, Austria, the Styria region in Austria, and going through and trying to find the contemporary names of some of these individual places is how I've been trying to feel out the edges of empire. And in this corner of the map, there's one piece. I think the military frontier is somewhere here-ish in the mid-17th century, so this is the very edge of Croatia. I also want to point out on this map areas that would have been more important to the Ottoman eye, and we know this because they took the time to write short vowels in on the map and not just in the text. So this is Bad Radkersburg is of enough strategic interest that pronunciation is actually important. Another personal favorite is Yanakalı, contemporary Győr, Hungary, then Rab, Austro-Hungarian Empire-ish. This is also an interesting way to talk about the difference between printing and drawing. Here, Rab appears to be on the margin as if it was added later, but this is definitely a single plate, and it's bleeding over the edge as an effect because there's something in the composition of the map that it has to be that they have to include enough that it doesn't quite fit. But this isn't drawn in afterwards. This is very likely just a single plate with a neat little spillover effect, as opposed to on the Ottoman version in Dimashqi's map. This had to be drawn in afterwards because it has to get along with the graticule ticks. So this is a different person than was drawing the original cities. And you'll notice that it's referred to as Yanık, burnt. A quick note: this is not because Ottoman forces burnt down this fortress. It's because Hungarian forces burnt down their own fortress when they realized that the enemy armies were approaching. So as they retreated, they burnt down their own fortress. The Ottoman forces arrived to a fort in embers. It was known as Yanakalı for another century or two. The map of Rome is not referred to as the Latin Campagna di Roma. Instead, Kızıl Elma, the red apple, soon it will be ours. I know this isn't really a contact zone, but in terms of a rather intentional change in naming convention, this is inserting an Ottoman view of the world into an atlas that is otherwise a very faithful reproduction of someone else's worldview. Similarly, at the southern tip of Spain and the top of Morocco, there's something wrong with my something is wrong with my image. There was a problem with the conversion. I will find a picture in the Q&A, but basically there are 2 extra cities added. Memleket Fes, the land of Fez, is inserted, as well as Al-Qasr. There's also a different type of label for what the Western Europeans are calling Al Jazeera, in that this would have been a then ruined fort town that would have had more significance in the Muslim world than to the people who are labeling it as if it's a city that's still around. In terms of future work, as someone who works in disaster, I'm always interested in the nature-culture relationship and trying to find what we can divine from the ways that the environmental features are depicted on both maps. One that I particularly enjoy is the hunt for volcanoes. This particular one in contemporary Mexico is an interesting one because it also suggests the multilingual aspect of map production. So here we have in Latin, forgive my Latin, Mons Flamiumus, Flaming Mountain. I can read, I just can't pronounce. And you'll see in this sense on the Ottoman version, Flamiumus, just acting as if a description is part of the name. So a direct transcription more so than translation. My volcano count is pretty high. I think I found 6 so far. But I'm sharing with you Mount Etna, which would have had its major explosion between the production of the Blaue Atlas and the production of the Dimashqi Atlas. That said, it was depicted as smoking in the Blaue Atlas as well. There have been a lot of eruptions, but I'm not sure if there's a bigger news by the time Dimashqi is producing his. And there's just this larger sense of what makes a mountain legible as a mountain, what makes a river legible as a river. The way that the river is depicted in the Latin version here, with many, many little islands that are also gestural. And we see a similar gesture here, but it's not continued all the way up. So what are both sides trying to communicate? Is this a question of signaling that this isn't a navigable river, or is this a general observation that there are lots of rocks here? How does that translate, and how is it operationalized in each map? And finally, we've only been looking at one copy of the atlas. The maps are wildly different in the TM copy. A quick example, here's Denmark in both of them. And here's Rome, Kızıl Elma, the red apple, or while this is upside down, it's the Iklim Papa, the realm of the Pope, with this beautiful inset map depicting, if not what Rome looks like, the idea of a city. So we have these two very different types of style, which could indicate whereas one is a really close reproduction, the other may be coming from a different mapping tradition in the 45 maps that are included in this manuscript copy. And just one little indicator a little bit closer. Oh, I'm missing a map. I'm missing a page. We'll do it a little bit here. You can see this kind of scalloping. Anytime you see scalloping like that, if it's not a Portolian map, which this is not, it's gesturing toward the Portolian tradition. So there's a visual style that is hearkening back to a very specific type of cartography that you see on one of these versions, but not the other. So there's something there about the intellectual genealogy and the practice, the genealogy of practice between these two types of maps in the different versions of the same corpus. And I think that is it, but I would very much enjoy hearing your questions. Thank you so much.
Yes, the floor is open for questions, comments.
Thank you for a wonderful talk. I literally learned a lot, and I'm also digging this jihad, which is the translation. And so I'm interested in a question that did you find any, I don't know if that's correct to use the word mismatching between the atlas and the textual information. Is there any like contradiction?
We are still at a preliminary stage. That's a step 2 between Fatih and I. I have honestly been working on the maps in their own little world. So I've had a very visual material blinders on, whereas Dr. Çalışır has spent a significant amount of time comparing the translation to the original text, and I might let him answer a little bit more on that aspect. We need to have a more baseline information before we start comparing the contradictions, but we're very close to doing so.
Thank you so much.
If I add something here, that work of Dimashq is a continuation of Katip Çelebi. When he died, Katip Çelebi, the manuscripts of Katip Çelebi were given by his mentor, Vishnezade İzzeti Mehmed Efendi, to one of his, let's say, PhD students. And Ebu Bekir Behramet Dimashqi was a PhD student of Vishnezade İzzeti Mehmed Efendi. He got his mulazimet from him. So we need to pay attention on the role of Vishnezade, who was the chief judge of Rumeli at the time, and was also from the family of famous Sheikhul Islam Yahya Efendi, who was playing the role of catalyst for the intellectual activities, and he was paying lots of attention on European production of maps, texts, and he also received some European guests in the meetings that he was organizing in his mansion. So when Katip Çelebi died, he realized that he had some unfinished work, like Cihannuma 2nd edition, and he said, "Oh, Ebu Bekir Behram, please continue to work on this work and finish it." And he also received financial support from the state for 10 years. That work that Eve just presented us was a state-sponsored project, intellectual project, that helped the Ottomans to gain an understanding of military, political, geographical developments of the world from the perspective of a Dutch geographer. And we need to, yes, you are right, we need to discuss this continuity in tradition of map making, because Cihannuma is the translation of and the production of the earlier attempt of Katip Çelebi when he was working on Atlas Minor. And now we are talking about Atlas Maior. So two traditions are continuing, one in Europe, the same family by the way, Blaus, and one in the Ottoman Empire. The tradition of this Atlas production in Dutch.
It's also worth saying that there's a strong possibility that the continuity between the Cihannuma and the Ottoman translation, the Atlas Maior, the textual continuity and the visual continuity may have been decoupled. And we can see that a little bit with the vast difference between the TM copy of the Ottoman translation of the Atlas Maior, which looks a lot more like the maps in the Cihannuma than the court copy. So we're looking at a mix of visual traditions that may or may not couple closely with the continuities and discontinuities of the text.
Any other question? It is more about 17th century intellectual life of the Ottomans, actually, and how to compare it with European intellectual life. And there is a way to discuss about the decline of Ottoman scientific production. You know, the main argument is there was no intellectual production of Ottomans after 16th century, let's say, but this is a clear case showing us that there is a great interest still in the Ottoman Empire, whatever available as an important, relevant knowledge for them in Europe in different languages, including Latin. So,
let me see if I...
Thank you so much. This was...
You?
Thank you so much. This was great. I'm wondering what it means to talk about the audience of a map and how the conceived audiences of these maps compare to each other, and what kind of an audience did the Ottoman map have or was intended to have, and how does that compare to the flow outputs?
Certainly. First, I think we need to remember that these are high production value, massive undertakings, and are only really available to a certain class of people. They're not made for navigation. They're not made to be hung on your wall. They are made to be sat in a beautiful on a beautiful table and poured over as a I don't know, as an act of intellectual splendor. So we're not looking at a huge map reading public. But when I talk about audience, I'm speaking less in terms of a demographic and more in terms of what a map reader, who a map reader is and what their expectations are in that period. So consider when we talk about a map reading public in the contemporary era, anyone with a smartphone is able to navigate on a map. 20 years ago, that was not the case. Not everyone could read a road atlas. The ideas of what an easy-to-read map was and is, these are evolving processes. So when I'm talking about the map reader at this stage of the research, I'm more interested in what is legible to someone of a high intellectual class and of a high social status. Is this more than a pretty thing? Do rivers read as rivers? Is this a knowable place? Is this a knowable place by the way that it's being illustrated? And the closeness between the various copies, even within the copies of the Damashki map, there are stylistic differences, but the principal components of the map remain stable and quite similar to what their Western European equivalents are. So part of this was a hope of finding a different kind of map reading logic, because of the ways that we read maps today and in the early modern era were by no means predestined, but the ways that the maps are presented suggest if someone could not read those maps as maps, they were expected to learn.
Any other question? Comment? No? Okay, thank you so much, Eve, for sharing your thoughts with us, and thank you for your time, for being here. We like to have a family photo here, right here, and if you like to join us, it's gonna be great. And thank you again, Eve.
Thank you.